I'm going to talk about the invasion of Russian olive along the Escalante River, and while the title may be a little tongue-in-cheek, I don't think it's completely tongue-in-cheek, as I'll show. I want to, before I start, I want to acknowledge collaborator John Spence with the National Park Service and funding support from the Walton Family Foundation. Also, thanks to Linda Whittam of the Nature Conservancy, who's offered lots of support and encouragement. Christine Rasmussen for lots of GIS counseling. And Pat Shafroth and Lindsay Reynolds with Pat USGS, Lindsay at Colorado State for helpful discussions along the way. Well, as you know, Russian olive is an important species, riparian species, even though it's non-native. Widespread throughout North America, and it's the fourth most common riparian species in the 17 woody riparian species in the 17 western states. And it's very commonly seen along many of our southwestern rivers and streams, often forming sort of near bank fringes along many of those rivers. And Chinle Wash here showing a rather dramatic example of that pattern. But I think that pattern has some interesting things to say about the invasion process, which I want to try and emphasize in my talk. Regarding Russian olive invasion in the Escalante watershed, here's some paired photos taken by Mr. Bob Wilburton, showing a stretch of the Escalante bottomland near Chop Rock Canyon in 1991. You can see kind of a braided channel, some unvegetated bars, riparian fringe primarily of cottonwood. And by 2005, there's been a dramatic channel narrowing with, again, this fringe of Russian olive inside and channelward of the streamward of the major cottonwood stands. Again, this was a relatively recent invasion, primarily, at least visually here, after 1991. Russian olive was planted in the watershed, though, in the 50s, if not earlier. And Bob, in his many hours spent along the Escalante, thought that Harris Wash, which is a large tributary, was an important contributor to seeds Russian olive to the Escalante River. And just conclude by saying that this invasion pattern, both the timing and the spatial pattern of the invasion, was similar to that described by Lindsay Reynolds and others who were working in Canyon de Chelly. So we'll try and shed a little light on some of the mechanics of this invasion, because I think it's important. There are lots of efforts underway to control, remove Russian olive, but I think it's important to try and at the same time understand the mechanisms behind the invasion process, since that could very well help to improve management, the efficiency of management efforts going forward. But even though the invasion of Russian olive along many of our rivers and streams has been relatively recent, I want to make the point that I think it's part of a much longer-term process that's been going on, both along the Escalante and many of our regional streams. And let me start with this turn-of-the-century photo showing the Escalante bottomland. And this photo matches. This is like texting. These things are like so small. I always hit the wrong buttons. But the Escalante bottomland matches early descriptions of being either a braided or a single thread channel and a wide grassy floodplain with scattered stands of cottonwoods on the outer edges of the floodplain. These bottomlands were, because of these well-watered, grassy expansive floodplains, were quite attractive to early settlers because it represented great forage in a otherwise pretty arid landscape. Well, if you look at the same view of the Escalante today, it's been radically transformed, and now you can see the bottomland is completely covered, or virtually completely covered, by primarily stands of cottonwood. There are a few scattered tamarisk as well, and that sort of channel fringe of Russian olives, which have appeared relatively recently. This represents a channel narrowing process, which is sort of the end point of an Arroyo cut-fill cycle, and which is illustrated here, and specifically for the Escalante, but the pattern repeated not particularly exactly in time, but more or less in general pattern and in general timing along many other regional streams. The Paria, the Virgin, for example. But if you look at the initial conditions illustrated in that early photograph, you could see a broad, a relatively narrow, shallow channel, broad floodplain, grassy primarily, probably alkali saccatone, other similar native grasses, cottonwoods out at the edge of the floodplain. Discontinuous little arroyos, head cuts were noted by early settlers in the area of Escalante town. But following a massive flood in 1909, those discontinuous arroyos were integrated into one big down-cut channel, which in places cut down up to 10 meters into the floodplain alluvium. And so you can see then this channel down cutting following 1909. Another very large flood in the early 30s widened the down cut channel into something similar to this. And the channel bars in the wide braided channel that were left behind in about the late 40s, early 50s started to be colonized by primarily cottonwood in the case of the Escalante. This was the beginning of a channel narrowing process which has proceeded through to today, and in which Russian olive has been participating most recently. So the reason I wanted to talk about this Arroyo cut-fill cycle and the channel narrowing that has characterized the sort of the end of this cut-fill cycle is because the mechanisms of invasion involve the channel narrowing and the appearance of Russian olive. And so let me kind of summarize real quickly the longer-term cut-fill cycles, and then sort of go into looking a little more closely at the narrowing specifically. Over the last 4,500 years, there have been 6 cut-fill cycles documented for the Escalante River. The most recent historical cutting, again, ended in the 1940s when the channel started narrowing, primarily with the establishment of cottonwoods on the active channel. And this also coincided with a decrease in summer monsoon precipitation and a relatively sustained period of small peak floods. The royal filling, like I said, is associated with channel narrowing and valley filling. The valley filling, as part of the cut-fill cycle, can take many hundreds of years, whereas the cut part of the cycle can take tens to hundreds of years. So the cutting can proceed very quickly, and then the narrowing and filling usually proceeds much more slowly. The narrowing specifically involves the establishment of vegetation on the formerly active channel, which then that vegetation traps sediments and begins to construct floodplains both vertically and laterally. And what's interesting about the Escalante is that the, in contrast to other regional streams, better? Okay. Cottonwood has been primarily involved in the narrowing, and many other streams like the Little Colorado that have similarly narrowed. Tamarisk has been the species primarily involved in the narrowing process. The reasons for the dominance of cottonwood along the Escalante is still kind of obscure at this point. Well, let me talk the remainder. I'll spend the remainder of my time talking, in detail about the narrowing process and the involvement of Russian olive in that narrowing. And here is an oblique photo taken in 1953 at the mouth of Harris Wash. And again, I mentioned that this is Harris Wash coming in here. Flow is in this direction. And again, Harris Wash is purported to be a source of seed to the Escalante from agricultural areas upstream in the Harris Wash drainage near Escalante town. Things to note here in this photograph is the wide, braided, virtually unvegetated active channel, and a pre-incision terrace with some old cottonwoods on this terrace, with the down cutting and then subsequent narrowing and filling. This is no longer flooded, so these trees are relatively old, represent again the pre-incision condition. And the other feature to note then is the young cottonwoods here on this mid-channel bar, and the incipient floodplain that those trees are building, both laterally and vertically. There's also a little sliver of incipient floodplain forming here, again in 1953. And the floodplain and the narrowing process then it will involve in progressive lateral and vertical accretion and encroachment of vegetation onto the channel, as you can see the same view in 1998. Narrowing has been exceedingly aggressive here. You can see the cottonwood. There are fewer on the pre-incision terrace now in 98. And you can see the older group of cottonwoods on the mid-channel bar. They're progressively younger stands of cottonwoods toward the center of one of the former channel braids, with cohorts of Russian olive lining these now overflow channels and the much narrowed main channel now. The fact that Russian olive is showing up channelward of the cottonwoods indicates that it started participating in the narrowing process much later than cottonwoods, as again observed in the those early Bill Wolverton or those Bill Wolverton photos from 98 and 2005. Well, I wanted to gain a more sort of extensive spatial understanding of this process of narrowing and the involvement of Russian olive in the narrowing process. So I resorted to GIS analysis of some imagery, and the imagery I used is located here. Just to sort of orient you to the plan view, I used the same location that you saw in the previous obliques. So there was that cottonwood on the pre-incision terrace, and there's that stand on the incipient floodplain in the channel bar. And this was a 1952 aerial imagery, pretty good quality. Arrow shows the direction of flow. And here's 2010 imagery. On both images, I identified floodplain surfaces, pre-incision terraces, active channel, and what were known to be young stands of cottonwoods and older cottonwoods on pre-incision terraces by cross-checking with the 2010 imagery. Yikes. And then I also used LiDAR data to help confirm geomorphic surface calls. This shows a detail of that area, and perhaps a poor choice of colors here, highlighting stands of Russian olive. And you can see in the 2010 photo that the Russian olive are primarily located next to the currently narrow active channel, a few scattered Russian olive in a former overflow channel on the modern floodplain. Overlaying on the 52 imagery, you can see again the Russian olive is not involved in the early floodplain formation, thus confirming its much later participation in the narrowing process. And this has a lot to do with some of the differences between the life history traits of cottonwood and tamarisk versus Russian olive. So I wanted to address some certain questions in a more spatially extensive way using the GIS, and here are some of the questions that I, at least in a preliminary way, am going to try and talk about in the very short amount of time I have remaining. The channel has narrowed. You can see that by inspection, but it's narrowed by an order of 10 from 36 meters in average width in 1952 imagery to 3.6 meters in the 2010 imagery. That narrowing is primarily accomplished by the establishment of cottonwood stands, which were placed into cover categories ranging from very sparse to dense. The cover categories for these cottonwoods range primarily, most of the establishing cottonwoods range from the sparse to the moderate cover categories. Partly, I think that's a reflection of the fact that the early establishing stands of cottonwoods established on relatively high bars, which remain pretty dry. And so those trees or stands have relatively sparse open canopies. Basically, the dark green showing the area of cottonwoods in two moderate and dense cover classes on the pre-incision terraces in 52, a loss of cottonwood cover in both those categories in 2010 to be expected. Those are relatively old trees. The area of cottonwood below Harris Wash is about twice in terms of hectares of Russian olive cover per kilometer of river than above Harris Wash, suggesting that indeed Harris Wash may be an important source of seed and invasion to the Escalante River main stem. In terms of Russian olive, the primary cover class was in the moderate cover class, again, in part, I think, reflecting the fact that most of those trees were in very close proximity to the channel, probably experience much more moist soil conditions than do cottonwoods on higher, drier bars further away from the channel. I intend to quantify the distance, average distance of Russian olive stands relative to the channel. Did some quick aging of Russian olive. There were Russian olive in the 70s, but there was a pulse in the 80s and another pulse in the 90s. If we can nail down, I intend to do more extensive aging in the future, and if we can nail down a pretty good age distribution of Russian olive, we might be able to pinpoint if there were specific hydrologic events that led to the establishment and spread of these trees. Again, I think part of the reason that the narrowing process has proceeded as we've seen is because of a long period of relatively low flows following the 1940s, following the two very large floods that occurred and were associated with cutting and widening in the channel. Just a little illustration of the process that I think is going on, and the main point being that as the channel continues to narrow, shear stresses on the floodplain are reduced because of the increased vegetation. This favors Russian olive. Russian olive then has greater probability of surviving. It survives closer to the channel, which with higher moisture conditions, so it's almost a positive deluge. At some point, I'm sure that that the narrowing is going to cease, and then what happens to Russian olive and cottonwood on the floodplain in the future becomes an interesting question. I'll just skip with the summary.